and welcome to Sammy's Bookshelf. I'm Sammy and today I am going to be doing my March wrap up, my Cluedo TBR for April, and also showing you my Orilium Readathon TBR. So, as you can tell, this video has a lot going on, but I think we can make it through. First, I'm going to go through my wrap-up for March. I've decided from now on that I'm going to collate my TBR and my wrap-ups together into one video. Let's just get started with the wrap-up and discuss what books I managed to read from my Cluedo TBR in March and what books I didn't manage to read and what's going to happen in terms of punishment / penalties with the books that I didn't read and when I do plan to read those books. The first book is a book that I showed you in my last video in my book haul, and it's the first book that I read in March, and that was XOXO by Axie O. This is about a girl named Jenny who meets a mysterious boy at her uncle's karaoke bar in LA, and they spend a really fun night together, but at the end of the night he has to leave to go back to South Korea, and despite him giving her his number when he leaves, he ghosts her. A couple months later, Jenny moves to South Korea because her grandma is sick and she is a cello prodigy, so she ends up going to this prestigious performing arts school in Seoul, and lo and behold, Jae-woo, the boy who she met on that night in LA at her uncle's karaoke bar, also goes to that school because he is a K-pop star and he is part of one of the most popular up-and-coming K-pop groups in South Korea, and then romance and fun ensues from there. This was a really cutesy book. It was adorable. If you love a cutesy young adult contemporary romance, you would definitely love this. It's a really fast book. You just fly through it and it's a lot of fun. I loved Jenny's relationship with all the characters. I think my biggest critique of this book was I felt the ending was slightly underwhelming, and I can't explain exactly why it was underwhelming without spoiling it. I didn't get like a super sense of satisfaction from the ending. It was kind of like, oh, it's ended. But I really enjoyed learning more about like the K-pop world because I knew nothing before this book, and really in the grand scheme of things I still know nothing. But from what I've read from other reviews, kind of the way that K-pop is described in this book is very realistic, and I always just have so much fun reading a book that's set in a country that's like not America or even like the UK. It was really fun to be in South Korea and Seoul. It's definitely not my favorite contemporary young adult romance book. I still had a lot of fun reading this. I ended up giving XOXO a 3 out of 5 stars. The next book I read was Tales from the Shadowhunter Academy by Cassandra Clare, Sarah Reese Brennan, Maureen Johnson, and Robin Wasserman. If you've been following my wrap-ups, you know for the past year I have been doing a big Cassandra Clare reread and rereading one of her books every month, and this month I read Tales from the Shadowhunter Academy, which I was really excited to reread because this is probably my favorite of Cassandra Clare's bind-up of short stories. I love this book, like it's just so good, and it doesn't really feel like a collection of short stories because all the stories take place in chronological order right after the other. They're all set in the Shadowhunter Academy, so it kind of just feels like a novel, which I really like. My favorite stories from this is just really any of the stories that we see Jem, Tessa, and Will, so the Whitechapel Fiend I really loved, and I also really love the short story Nothing But Shadows because it mainly follows James and Matthew and how they came to be best friends and eventually parabatai. And as someone who loves The Last Hours, I love the characters from The Last Hours. I just loved that short story. If you are currently reading the Shadowhunter Chronicles, I'd highly recommend reading Tales from the Shadowhunter Academy before Lady Midnight. I read this book before Lady Midnight originally, and it just makes Lady Midnight just a teensy bit better. Like, obviously Lady Midnight is already a fantastic book, but just certain plot lines are just made better in Lady Midnight if you've read Tales from the Shadowhunter Academy. You don't have to, it's not required reading. I personally recommend it. I gave Tales from the Shadowhunter Academy a 4.5 out of 5 stars. The next book I read is finally a book off of my March Cluedo TBR, and that was We Were Liars by E. Lockhart, which this is a reread. I originally read this when I was 13, and now I read it again, and it was really interesting rereading this book now that I'm so much older. I definitely don't think I enjoyed it as much as I did when I was 13. I feel like the story is now way more predictable now that I'm older and, you know, a bit smarter. Like, I feel like even though I already knew the ending because I had already read it, I feel like even if I was reading this for the first time, I would figure out the ending. But I still really enjoyed this book. I still think it's really impactful, and I still think it's really cleverly written. Reading this book for the first time is a very unique experience. It's not the same as doing a reread when you already know what's going to happen. So I do also feel like it still wouldn't have been as good the second time around, because reading it for the first time is one of those books that you wish you could erase from your memory and read for the first time again. I ended up giving it a 4 out of 5 stars. The last full book that I read in March, I know I only read 4 books this month, and I'm going to explain why in a second, but the last book I managed to read in March was From Lukov with Love by Mariana Zapata. This book was just so good. It was so cute. If you don't know what this book is about, it is about a girl named Jasmine, and she is a figure skater. Despite working really hard for years and years and years and being extremely passionate about figure skating, at 26 she really feels like she has nothing to show for it, and she feels like her dream of being a competitive figure skater and winning a gold medal is passing her by. But she's given a second chance when she is given the opportunity to do pair skating with Ivan Lukov. The only catch is that Ivan is her arch nemesis. If you love a slow burn enemies to lovers romance, this is the book for you. I had so much fun reading this book. I immediately started reading it and just fell in love with Ivan and Jasmine and their relationship. I loved their banter and bickering at the beginning of the book. I was literally giggling like a crazy person because I just was so excited about the upcoming romance I knew was going to ensue. I really love the big family dynamic. Jasmine in this book has this big family and lots of siblings, and I loved her dynamic with her family. And this book is what momentarily got me out of a reading slump. I have been in a reading slump for most of March, hence why I haven't read that many books this month, and this book got me right out of the reading slump. I then had to take a break from reading because I had this huge assignment that I had to do that was due for university that I had to do all weekend, which then put me back in a reading slump. And then instead of getting right back into reading after I finished that assignment, I binge watched Bridgerton instead. And we all know Netflix is one of reading's greatest enemies, and so I was then put back in the reading slump. But From Lukov with Love, definitely, if I didn't have that big assignment and I could just have kept reading, it definitely would have gotten me out of the reading slump. So if you're in a reading slump and you're a fan of enemies to lovers romance and like contemporary cutesy books are what get you out of a reading slump, this I would highly recommend. I gave this a 4.3 out of 5 stars. Now there's one more book that I guess I should discuss, but it was a book that I did not finish and I don't think I'm probably gonna pick it up again, and that was The Rumor Game by Danielle Clayton. I picked up this book because it was a Booksplosion book of the month, and I like to read their book of the months and join in with the live shows. But this was the first book I tried to pick up after I did that big assignment. It was in that reading slump and it just wasn't doing it for me. Like, I read the first about 120 to 150 pages. I was just finding it incredibly boring. I think if I wasn't in a reading slump, I could have pushed through and probably still liked the book. I felt like it probably would have been maybe a 3 out of 5 stars. But because I was in a reading slump, I could just tell that this book, if I just continued to read it, was gonna push me further into a reading slump, which obviously I really didn't want that to happen, especially because, like I said, I am doing the Orilium Readathon, which is the whole month of April, and I really want to do a good job, so I really didn't want to push myself further into a reading slump, and so I decided to make the decision to DNF the book. I think I spent more time deciding if I was going to DNF this book or not than actually reading it, because I always feel so guilty when I DNF a book, but it had to happen, especially with the readathon. It's already the 1st of April, and if I continued to read the Rumor Game, I probably would have still been reading it into April, and I wouldn't have been able to count that as a book that I read for the readathon, and I really wanted to start a new book on the 1st of April on the day of the readathon, so that's why I decided to DNF it, but I still feel really guilty about it. So let's talk about the books that I had on my TBR for March that I did not manage to read. I will preface this by saying that the reason I did not get to these books is because I'm in a reading slump. I didn't read a lot this month and I just didn't get to them. In terms of penalties, I am going to be light on myself because it is the first time I'm doing a TBR game and having a TBR, and so I'm still getting used to it, and also this month I was in a reading slump. So the first book that was on my TBR for March that I did not read was Free the Stars by Hafsah Faizal. This was a book I really wanted to read in March because I read the first book in February, and I did start to read this book. Well, not really. I opened it and I got to the title page, and I was just thinking about whether it was wise to read this book, because at this point I was out of denial that I was in a reading slump. I was in denial of my reading slump for much of March. I'm not really a big fan of reading fantasy books, especially high fantasy books, when I'm in a slump, because I feel like high fantasy books are a bit harder to read. There are all these new terms and things you have to understand, and from reading slumps, I feel like it's best to read books that are usually set in our world and just are easy to read and easy to get through, and this is not that book. I just decided if I read it now, I probably wouldn't enjoy it, and it wouldn't really be fair to read this book now, and so I think for this book, my plan is I still want to read it because I still enjoyed the first book. I was a little disappointed with it, but I still liked it enough that I still want to complete the duology, and I decided with my penalties is just going to be is that I'm going to have to add on the books to a different month, so I'm going to have more books on my TBR. So I've decided for Free the Stars, I'm going to push back this book until my May TBR and read it in May. So I'm hoping that with this readathon and just the time that April will give me to get out of the reading slump, by May I should be out of my reading slump and ready to read high fantasy again, and that's the plan for Free the Stars. The next book that I didn't read in March was Red Sparrow by Jason Matthews. This is a book I didn't get to at all because I was just reading really slowly and had, big gaps, wasn't reading at all, and so I just didn't manage to get to it. But this is another one where I feel like I need to read this when I'm out of a slump. This isn't the kind of book that's going to get me out of my reading slump. So like with Free the Stars, I'm also going to push this back and read it in May. And the last book I didn't manage to get to in March was The Spanish Love Deception by Elena Armas. This is a book that would get me out of a reading slump. I just didn't get to it in March. And so for this book, I'm going to add it on into my April TBR. So this will be an extra book that I have to read in April. So that's my penalty, is I have to read an extra book. So now that we've gotten through the wrap-up portion and the explanation/excuses portion of why I didn't read all my March books is over, I think it is now time to pick out the books that I'm going to be reading in April for my April Cluedo TBR. So my plan for my Cluedo TBR and also for my Orilium TBR is that I'm going to pick out all of my books for my Cluedo TBR and then assess, and I'm hoping that the books that I pick out for my Cluedo TBR will also fit with the prompts I have to read for Orilium. Hopefully that makes sense. So let's just go into the prompts for Cluedo TBR. It's time to play Cluedo TBR. So if you remember from last month, I have 2 intrigue cards that I have not used yet that I could potentially use in this game this month. I've also put all my tokens where they were last month. So every month that we do this, we just play on from the previous month. Of course, the first thing I'm going to do is roll a black dice to figure out which token I'm going to be using. 3, 3. So 3 is white. So right now, white is in the new adult / adult contemporary room. So let's see where we can go. So we got a 9. Okay, so with 9, I can either go to the paranormal room, the thriller room, or I could use a secret passageway to go to the fantasy room. I'm in a bit of a pickle because I already have some books in mind that I know that I'm probably going to end up reading for the readathon, and so I kind of want to try and get in those genres rooms, and neither of them are paranormal and thriller books. But also, if I go into the fantasy room, there's a chance I'm going to get a prompt that I'm going to have to read like an 1,000-page fantasy book, and that's not what I need right now. But I think I'm just gonna take the risk and go into the fantasy room and bypass my dice roll and use the secret passage. So I'm gonna go into the fantasy room via the secret passage. So the first room that we landed in was the fantasy room. So let's spin the wheel and see what prompt I get for this genre. The prompt that I landed on was a book with a 4-star rating on Goodreads. This is a pretty easy prompt to fulfill. So for this prompt, I am going to be reading Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief by Riordan. I have been really wanting to reread Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief and then go on with the rest of the series for a really long time now, and I think Percy Jackson is the perfect book to read this month because I think it's a really good book to get me out of my reading slump because it's fun. Percy is a really funny character. This will be perfect to read in April. Let's go on to the next round. 2 is blue. So blue, we were in the fantasy room. So let's see where we can go. Okay, I rolled a 2 and I also rolled a question mark, so I get to pick up an intrigue card. And I got the Move Anywhere card. So this is going to be really helpful. I'm not sure if I'm going to use it today, but we'll see. Maybe I will. I only got a 2, so oh my god, if I go like this, I have to get another intrigue card. So I guess I'm picking up another intrigue card. I guess I'm definitely going to use one of my intrigue cards today in this game. So I got, you can stay in that room and read a prompt. Okay, so we didn't get to pick a book for that round, so let's go into the next round. 3 again! So I just realized I accidentally used the purple token before, not the white token when I had 3 before, but I just switched them. It's the same thing. So we're in the fantasy room. Let's see where we can go. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Okay, so I can either go in the dystopian room, the mystery room, or I can again use a secret passageway and go to new adult / adult contemporary, which honestly, I think I'm gonna do that because, like I said, I'm in a reading slump, and when I'm in a reading slump, the thing I usually want to read is contemporary books, and I have a lot of contemporary books in mind that I could read for the readathon, so I think I'm just gonna end up using the secret passage again and go back to new adult / adult contemporary. The next room I landed in was the new adult / adult contemporary room. I'm excited for this one because contemporary books are what I love to read during a slump, so this should be good. So the book I have chosen for this prompt is Roomies by Christina Lauren. I have read a couple of Christina Lauren books now, and from reading those books, I know Christina Lauren books are really cutesy and fast-paced, and this one is pretty short, so I definitely think this is a book I could read in one sitting. And also, I'm just super excited to read another Christina Lauren book because Christina Lauren is one of my favorite contemporary authors. Next round. 2. Where's my 2? Ah, perfect. Okay. This is actually good. So that's my blue token that we couldn't really go anywhere with before because we only rolled a 2. So I'm hoping that I can get into the sci-fi room because I do have a sci-fi book in mind for the readathon. So I rolled an 8 and I think that should be enough to get me into the sci-fi room. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The next room I landed in was the sci-fi room. So let's pick a prompt for that genre. For the sci-fi prompt, I got read a book that has my favorite color on it, and I think I should be able to find a book with my favorite color on it. My favorite colors are blue and green. The book I have chosen for this prompt is These Broken Stars by Amie Kaufman and Megan Spooner. So this has blue on the cover and also green, and blue and green are my favorite colors. Let's go into the next round. 1. The 1 token is finally getting off the starting point. Let's see what I roll. A 6. The only place I can go with my red token is in the fantasy room. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so we landed in fantasy, so we have to pick another fantasy book for this month. For the next genre, I landed back in the fantasy room, so let's pick another prompt for the fantasy genre. I've landed on a prompt, a book recommended by an author you love. Now normally this would be very easy to find a book for. I really want to try and pick fantasy books that are standalones and also not too long. All the books that I can think of that have been recommended or are blurbed by some of my favorite authors are all books in a series or just really thick books, and so I think I'm going to use one of my intrigue cards. I'm going to use the prompt stays unread, read a new prompt, and pick a new prompt for this genre, and hopefully it'll be a prompt where I can pick a fantasy book that is not 1,000 pages long. Don't forget that I'm in a reading slump and I'm doing a readathon, which is why I don't want a really big book to read this month. So for my second attempt at this prompt for the fantasy genre, I got a book with illustrations, and so for this prompt I'm going to read Sorcery of Thorns by Margaret Rogerson. This is a fantasy standalone, it's not too big, and it has a map in it, so it has illustrations. This is going to be perfect. It's got an enemies to lovers romance, my favorite trope, and so I think this should be a good book to help me get out of my reading slump. 4. 4 is green, and that was in young adult contemporary. So let's roll and see where we go. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. There are 3 potential rooms I can go in. I can either use the secret passage and go into the sci-fi room, or I could potentially go into the paranormal room or the dystopian room. So I think for this round, I'm gonna use one of my intrigue cards. I'm gonna use the you can stay in that room and read a prompt because, like I said, when I'm in a reading slump, I really like to read contemporaries. I really want to stay in the young adult contemporary room and read a fun, cutesy young adult contemporary. For the last prompt for my April Cluedo TBR game, I stayed in the young adult contemporary room, so I will pick a prompt from the young adult contemporary genre. I got Read a Book That You Forgot You Had. This is pretty easy for me because I have so many books that just slip my mind that I forget that I bought them. So the book that I picked for this prompt is If There's No Tomorrow by Jennifer L. Armentrout. I always forget that I have this book, and I always think that I have no young adult contemporary books on my shelf that I haven't read yet, but then I stumble across this and I'm like, oh yeah, I have a Jennifer L. Armentrout book that I haven't read yet. So I have If There's No Tomorrow. This is one that I'm kind of nervous to read because the last Jennifer L. Armentrout book that I read that was a contemporary, I didn't enjoy it that much. I actually have a full review on it. It's my first ever video, which was The Problem with Forever by Jennifer L. Armentrout. So that is all the books that I have picked out for my Cluedo TBR. It is now time to look at the prompts for the Orilium Readathon and figure out what can overlap, and also obviously pick out some other books that fit the prompts that don't overlap with my Cluedo TBR. So if you don't know what the Orilium Readathon is, it is a readathon hosted and created by Book Roasts, and it's kind of like a role-playing readathon. Book Roasts created this whole fantasy world that this readathon takes place in, and pretty much what you do is you create a character, and this character goes to a magic university, and then you have to read books to pass the classes that you are taking at this magic university. I will leave the link to Book Roast's announcement video in the description because she explains the readathon way better than I ever could. And the way that you decide what subjects that you will be taking at Orilium, which is the magic university, is by picking a calling. So Book Roast has created these little booklets that have information about the fantasy world, and this one in particular has information about all the callings that you can pick. So your calling is just like your future career. There's also another booklet that has a brief history of the fantasy world and Orilium and all the different supernatural creatures that live in this fantasy world, and of course I read this because it's just so amazing and creative and awesome. Oh, and I also forgot to mention that you also get sorted into different guilds. So I'm in the Mindwalker guild, and there's this quiz that you can take to figure out what guild you are, and when you read books and pass classes, you earn points for your guild. The calling that I've decided on is the Dreamwalker calling. This is a Mindwalker exclusive, so only people who are in the Mindwalker guild can choose this as their calling, so that's one I've chosen. For this readathon, it is the Spring Equinox. For this Spring Equinox, the classes I am taking are Astronomy, Alchemy, Art of Illusion, Spells, Incantation, Psionics and Divination, Conjuration, and Law. And then there's also, of course, a syllabus. So this syllabus is what tells you what prompts each of the subjects have. So I'm going to go through each of the prompts and show you the book I intend to read for these prompts, and you will see that some of them will overlap with my Cluedo TBR as well. For Alchemy, I have to read a book featuring romance. This is pretty easy because I'm pretty sure every single book on my TBR features romance. For this prompt, I'm going to use If There's No Tomorrow by Jennifer L. Armentrout. This is a Jennifer L. Armentrout book, so it definitely has romance in it. For Art of Illusion, the reading prompt is a book with a trope you like. For this prompt, I'm going to pick the Spanish Love Deception. This has an enemies to lovers romance, and so that also fits in nicely with my Cluedo TBR since I have to add this book onto my TBR this month as a penalty for not reading it last month. For Astronomy, I have to read a book that's on the top of my to be read list. I have chosen The Lost Book of the White by Cassandra Clare and Wesley Chu. As I mentioned earlier in the video in my wrap up, I'm reading a Cassandra Clare book at the start of every month. It's the start of April, so it's time for me to read The Lost Book of the White, which is actually my final Cassandra Clare book that I'm reading as part of my big Cassandra Clare reread. So I'm going to use this one as the book that's on the top of my to be read list. For Conjuration, the reading prompt is Source of Light on the cover. I'm going to use Roomies by Christina. On the cover, as you can see, it has all these buildings and they are all emitting light. For Spells and Incantations, the reading prompt is read a short story / essay. And so for this prompt, I am going to be reading the short story This Night So Dark. This short story comes in between These Broken Stars and This Shadowed World, which is of course the first and second book in the These Broken Broken Stars trilogy, and so I'm going to be reading the short story that comes in between those two books, of course, after I read these Broken Stars. The next subject is law, and so the reading prompt for that class is mythology inspired. I'm going to be reading Percy Jackson and Lightning Thief because obviously Percy Jackson is inspired by Greek mythology. Finally, the last class I will be taking at Orilium in the spring equinox is Psionics and Divination, and the reading prompt for that class is a book set in the future, and for this I am using These Broken Stars by Amie Kaufman and Megan Spooner. This is a sci-fi, it's set in the future. Perfect. So as you can see, I overlapped a lot of my Cluedo TBR books with my Orilium TBR to make things a little easier because I still wanted to do my Cluedo TBR this month. I was debating whether I would just skip it this month, but I just decided to do it anyway because it's just an extra little challenge, and as of right now I am 2 books behind on my reading challenge because of the reading slump that I've been in March, and so I really need to catch up, and so having all these prompts that I need to fulfill for this month will hopefully get me back on track. And of course, don't forget, if you want to know more about Orilium and actually hear a more thought out, better explanation of what the readathon is, because I definitely did not explain it well, go and check out the announcement video that Book Roast did. She's awesome, so creative, and she explains it really well. So that is the end of my video. I'm sorry if it was a bit convoluted. Let me know if you are doing the Orilium Readathon and what books are on your TBR and what your calling is. I'm so interested to see what everyone's picked for their calling and also what guild you are in. Or if you're not doing any readathons, just let me know what you're planning to read in April. Hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time. Bye!